Well, hello everybody. My name is Caroline Beck and I'd like to welcome you to the Durham Book Festival with David Almond. I once stayed in a house in Donegal with my children when they were very young, and one night as the wind was trying to rip the roof from the house, we snuggled up in bed and I began to read a book to them. That book was Skellig by tonight's guest, and inside those pages we discovered a story so powerful that not even an Irish storm could distract us. It had so many echoes of other books and writers inside of it, of William Blake and his obsession with angels, of the filthy, fearless part boy, part caveman Stig of the Dump, and of the secret garden and the intrepid heroine Mary Lennox. And I had that evening a powerful sense of a writer who is also a reader. So David has been given more awards for his writing than I could decently list here, but I suspect that most people in the audience will have a favourite book of his that has stayed with them, discovered by either reading it or having it read to them. So his book of short stories, Half a Creature from the Sea, has been this year's festival's big read, with 3,000 copies distributed free across schools, libraries, businesses, prisons and to the university. And with its blending of the everyday and the fantastical, the stories are transformative and transfixing, but always rooted in the place that David was born into and has made his home, the northeast of England. David, welcome. I wanted to ask you, have you always been a reader?
Yeah, I was always a reader. When I was a kid, I went to the library. I remember the first librarian, she was very scary. The library was up some narrow steps to get to the top of this building at the bottom of Felling High Street, which is where I came from. And yes, I remember plundering the shelves and then going to another library when that library was renewed. Yeah, so I used to go to the library. That was where I read.
And what did you read? What were the kind of things that you read?
I used to read all kinds of stuff. I loved myths and legends. I think my favourite writer, whenever I think back to childhood reading, I think of Roger Lancelyn Green, who did retellings of myths and legends. And his work is still in print. It's never been out of print. And one book I remember particularly was King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, and a gorgeous puffin edition with amazing illustrations by a German illustrator called Lotte Reininger. And I think, you know, one of the things I love about writing for young people is the fact that you can do illustrated books. And that was my first love of illustrated books. Yeah.
And one of the great things about libraries, because I too got my entire reading education from a library, was that you could sit on the floor and you can run your finger along the spines of the books and you can pick up anything that you want. You know, we're slightly in this sort of algorithm age now where if you pick up one, you get recommended something that is quite similar. So you end up reading the same kind of genre all the time. Whereas actually in those days, you could just read whatever you liked.
That's right. And I think that's what the library closers don't understand. I'm have been involved in a battle in Bath to save the Central Library there. And the people who are saying, well, we can close the library down because you can click and collect a book on the internet. It's the total opposite of what true library use is. True library use is serendipitous. You look around, you discover things, you find the exact thing you were looking for, but you didn't know you were looking for it. Yeah.
And what was your, I mean, you were talking about myths and legends and things. What was can you remember the first book that you picked up and that really, really engrossed you? Because often when you're a child, you do this sort of free-range reading, don't you? You do a little bit of a dip here and a little bit of a dip there. But what was the first book that really grabbed your attention and you sat and read it from cover to cover?
I think that one did. Also a book called The Adventures of Turkey by an Australian writer called Ray Harris. Again, it was illustrated. And it had a really vivid effect on me when I was about 10, I think. And then years later, decades later, I thought, I remember this book. I didn't have a copy, and I thought, maybe it wasn't as good as I thought it was. And I discovered one in an Oxfam shop. And I sort of opened it with trepidation. It was fantastic. Yeah.
Did you know at that age, when you were 10 and going to the library, did you know that you wanted to be a writer? Did you know any writers? I mean, were you in that, you know, I mean, did you think it was something you could become even?
I knew I wanted to be a writer. I did from the time I was quite young. The sense of kind of professional writers was, you know. But my uncle, I had an uncle who was a writer, my Uncle Amos, and he used to write novels and stories and plays and poems, and none of his work was ever published, but he didn't care, and he just did it because he loved it. And he went to Australia and hated Australia, came back, and he wrote a book called You Can Drown the Aussies in Their Frozen Beer. And he said they won't publish it because they'll say it's against Australia. And then he told me about a play he'd written And he said, I've written a whole play, Dave, a 3-act play. He said, it's for Marianne Faithfull, because she's so beautiful. Of course, that was never produced, but he didn't care. And the sense of having somebody like that really was inspiring. I thought, yeah, so I can do it.
And how did the rest of your family treat him? Because sometimes when you get these people who are slightly kind of outside the milieu, they are sort of black sheep, and they're slightly odd people. But actually, as a child, they're really exciting, aren't
Very exciting. He was seen by some of his family as being very, oh yes, Amos, they loved him. But others thought, oh God, Amos. And I remember at family parties, people would sing their songs and do their turns. And when Amos had enough to drink, he'd start fiddling inside his top pocket. And he'd take out a bit of paper.
And did everyone groan?
And people said, oh no, he's going to read his poem again. And I remember saying, oh, I've got an uncle that writes poetry. Yeah.
And so, you know, you thought that you maybe wanted to be a writer. You had this uncle who was very exciting and maybe a bit of a role model for you. But at what point did you think, okay, actually, well, I mean, at what point did you start scribbling away? Because it would have been scribbling away in those days, wouldn't it?
It was, and from the time I was very young, probably when I was 7 or 8, I used to write stories down on the paper, and you know, I've got memories of folding them over and kind of stitching them into books, which so many children do. It's not unusual. You know, it's still not unusual. You know, I talked to 500 children the other day in Durham Johnson School from all across Durham, and I said to them, who likes to write? So many children like to write because it's something that's very natural. So I just did that. And people say, when did you start writing, if you're a writer? But actually, writers are people who just didn't stop. They just kept on going.
What do you think that thing is about sort of, you know, stitching it into books and things like that? Was that a kind of, that you wanted to keep a part of you secret? Or was that a sort of embarrassment that you were writing and maybe you didn't think it was any good?
No, it was to make a cover. So you folded it over and stitched it so it looked like a proper book.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, so that's what it was.
Yeah.
And it was a way of, it wasn't a way of kind of publishing. I never showed it to many people. But it was a way of saying, oh, look what I do. And it's very similar to what I do now. You know, I work in notebooks and I print out things and I put them together with bulldog clips and they become very kind of, you know, very attentive to making things. And it's making things beautiful, I think. It was a kind of an attempt to make something lovely.
And how physically do you write these days? Do you write on the computer? Do you scribble away at notes?
I use notebooks and I use the computer. The computer's fantastic. But the thing about a finished book is, it looks like an object of perfection. And, you know, when people say, I'm going to write a book, and then they look at a book and think, but it looks damn impossible. And I remember when I was young, I used to look at books and think, I'll never be able to do that. Because it looks perfect, but we aren't perfect. You know, we're imperfect. And if we were perfect, we wouldn't have to do anything at all. So imperfection is at the heart of all creativity. So I begin with messy notebooks, and notebooks are my pride and joy, and I just make messes. I mean, I ask you now, who likes notebooks?
Oh, who doesn't?
You know?
Who doesn't like a notebook?
Who likes pencil cases? I know. You know, and in here are some of the great inventions of humankind. A green highlighter. And you think, you know, what's he doing talking about these things? So it's because writing can be so hard, but it's an imperfect process. So you think, well, it's playful, it's childlike, it's imperfect. I'll just mess about in a notebook. And in the process of messing around in notebooks, stories begin to come to life. And then I work on the computer. Yeah.
So you were scribbling away when you were a child, but you didn't start writing till you were a little bit older, and you became a teacher. And at what point did you think, okay, I've got this in me, and I really want to put it down?
All the time, really, but it was fragments. You know, all the time I was at university, I was writing bits of plays, bits of poems, bits of novels. In fact, I was just looking through my kind of boxes of archive just the other day, and the stuff from 40 years ago, that poems and plays and constant attempts to get this thing going. And then I remember the first time I finished a short story, and I thought, oh, it's about time I tried to finish something. And the first moment I finished a short story, and it was a great feeling. I've actually finished something.
Okay, this might be a good time then to have Half a Creature from the Sea, because this is a set of short stories, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this has been the big read for the festival.
Yeah.
So would you mind reading a little bit for
I'll read a
us?
bit from,
Thank you.
Half a Creature from the Sea. So this is a collection of short stories and autobiographical fragments. When I lived in Felon, when I was a boy, and I said to people I want to be a writer, I'd say, well, what are you going to have to write about, son? You're just a kid from Felling. This book has an illustration of Felling High Street on it. So if I could go back in time and say, look, I'm going to write about Felling, and it's going to be read in lots of countries. I'll say, how would you do that? I'll read the beginning of a story called Slog's Dad. And Slog's Dad was a story that was commissioned by New Writing North some years ago, and then subsequently became a graphic novel with the great Dave McKean, and now is a story inside this collection. And it's set in Felling Square, which is where I used to run as a kid. So it was a great joy to me to write a story that's set right in the place where I used to play. And a pork shop is mentioned, which made the most delicious pies and sandwiches. Slog's Dad. Spring had come. I'd been running round all day with Slog and we were starving. We were crossing the square to Myers pork shop when Slog stopped Dad in his tracks. What's up, I said. He nodded across the square. Look, he said. Look at what? It's me dad, he whispered. Your dad? Aye. I just looked at him. That bloke there, he said. What bloke? Where? Him on the bench. Him with a cap on. Him with a stick. I shielded my eyes from the sun with my hand and I tried to see. The bloke had his hands resting on the top of the stick. He had his chin resting on his hands. His hair was long and tangled and his clothes were tattered and worn, like he was poor or like he'd been on a long journey. His face was in the shadow of the brim of his cap, but you could see that he was smiling. But Slogger, man, I said, your dad's dead. I know that, Davy, but it's him. He's come back again, like he said he would in the spring. He raised his arm and he waved. Dad, he shouted, Dad. The bloke waved back. See, said Slog, how are? He tugged at my arm. No, I whispered, no. And I yanked myself free, and I went into Myers, and Slog ran across the square to his dad. Slog's dad had been a binman, a skinny bloke with a creased face and a greasy black cap. He was always puffing on a woodbine. He hung onto the back of the bin wagon as it lurched through the estate. He jumped off and on and slung the bins over his shoulder, tipped the muck into the back. He was forever singing hymns, Faith of Our Father, Hail Glorious St. Patrick, stuff like that. Here he comes again, my mum would say, as he bashed the bins and belted out O Sacred Heart at 8 o'clock on a Thursday morning. But you'd be smiling, because everybody liked Slog's dad, Joe Mickley, a daft and canny soul. The first sign of his illness was just a bit of a limp. Then Slog came to school one day and he said, me dad's got a black spot on his big toenail. Just like Treasure Island, I said. What's it mean, he says. I was going to say death and doom, but I said he could try asking the doctor. He has asked the doctor. Slog looked down. I could smell his dad in him, the scent of rotten rubbish that was always on him. They lived just down the street from us, and the whole house had that smell in it, no matter how much Mrs. Mickley washed and scrubbed. Slog's dad knew it. He said it was the smell of the earth. He said there'd be nowt like it in heaven. The doctor says it's nowt, said Slog, but he's staying in bed today, and he's going to hospital tomorrow. What does it mean, Davy? How should I know, I said. I shrugged. It's just a spot, man, Slog.
I remember hearing an interview with you, David, some years back, and you said that it wasn't until you realised and recognised that you could write about this place that you had grown up in, that you thought it was a legitimate subject, you felt it was a legitimate subject for writing, that you really found your voice. So it's quite a common thing, isn't it? Because, you know, what is normal to you as a child just seems not extraordinary at all. Yeah. But actually what you've done is that you've pulled out all these characters like Slog's dad, you know, all these other characters from your childhood, and you've made them into something kind of extraordinary. So at what point did you think, I can write about this?
Yeah, it was after kind of trying to refuse it, and I think a lot of writers go through that process. And I remember thinking, I don't want to be seen as a northern writer, because if you say I'm a writer, you know, in that voice, people think, I know what you write about, mate. So I kind of tried to write away, and I kind of wrote this, tried to write something that was nothing to do with that. And it was only when I sighed and said, there's nothing I can do about it. You know, I come from Felling. I speak in this voice. This is the language I speak. And also, whatever I do about it, you know, Catholicism is in my blood and bones. So it was like just saying, oh, God, all right. accepting it and then accepting it and realizing that actually that would be the foundation of, everything that I could write. And some people would say, it's really interesting, now I meet lots of what would think is very privileged people. But I found a way, I think, and I think it's something that lots of writers have to do, is to find things that other people would say are disadvantages, like the fact that I didn't come from a literary background, the fact that I came from Tyneside, the fact that I was kind of Catholic, that all these I grew up on a council estate, to turn those things into my own privileges, to turn what could be seen as disadvantages into privileges. And that's what I've tried to do.
So you mentioned being a Catholic and being brought up a Catholic, which is a strong thing that runs all the way through your books. Now, we have actually committed you to Writer's Purgatory in that we have made you choose 5 books, which I know for a writer, 5 books which have been very influential to you. And I know for a writer that's like saying, which is your favourite child? Yeah. And I have to tell you, I've been emailing David for about a couple of weeks and saying, you need to get 5 books to me. And every time he's got 5 books to me, he says, can I have a new list? And I've said, no, you can't. So these books that we're going with tonight are the definitive list, I think, well, at least for this evening.
I've made a new one.
Have you? Well, we're not going to talk about that. But one of the books that you came up with was the Penny Catechism. So let's talk about the Penny Catechism. Yeah.
Are there any Catholics in the audience?
Of course.
Does anybody remember the Penny Catechism?
Yes.
Who remembers the first question? Who made you? The second question. Why did God make you? God made you to know Him, love Him, and serve Him in this world, and to be with Him forever in the next. And we were taught this thing from the time we were 4 or 5 years old. And I remember it was the main thing. People talk about the Bible. In a sense, the Bible has nothing to do with Catholicism. The Catechism is the thing. And when I was thinking about the books that have actually made me, this was a central book, the Catechism that we used to get tested on every Friday morning. The head teacher would come into the classroom and test everyone, go right around the class. And usually it was okay because my name started with A, so it was Almond. Who made you? God made me.
So you didn't get any of the difficult bits.
That's right. So if you started with M or something, it would be, is the Pope the shepherd and teacher of all Christians? And then you've got a 5-line answer to come up with. So and when I looked at it again, it was actually quite a charming thing, but it's also scary. It was a very frightening thing to be tested on the faith.
And also, is it to do with learning it by rote? Because you have to do that, because if you don't learn it by rote, as you've just indicated, you will get a rap on the knuckles. But also that very first line, who made you? God, God made me. It's got a rhythm to it, hasn't it? Which is, as a child, is kind of easier to learn than maybe lots of other things.
That's right. And, when I'm writing now, I can feel the rhythms of the Catechism in my work. And the same as another book that I would have chosen was The Order of the Mass, the Order of the Latin Mass. I was an altar boy. Any altar boys in the audience? Yeah, I was an altar boy and learned the Latin Mass off by heart and didn't have a clue what it meant, but we knelt there. So Suscipiat Dominus Sacrificium de manibus tuus ad laudem et gloriam nominus sui, ad utilitate quod nostrum sociusque ecclesiae sui sancti. Didn't have a clue what it meant, but there was a deep beauty in it, which comes out in my work now, I think.
It's often said that the things that we learn when we're children, because we're so porous, aren't we, from sort of 6, 7, as soon as we can read properly, up until the age of 21, are the things that really, really deeply affect us for the rest of our lives, actually. Yes. Yeah. And so, but not all of these books are from that time, are they? The ones that we're going to talk about. No. But that was the first one that really sort of stirred you, was it?
When I was thinking about which book really had an impact on me when I was young, and I thought about talking about Roger Lansdowne Green and the King Arthur stories, or Ray Harris and The Adventures of Turkey, or Enid Blyton. I used to pinch my sister's Enid Blytons, and the landscapes of Enid Blyton have been very kind of powerful to me. But it was the Catechism, and the Order of the Mass.
I mean, there are lots of writers who are Catholics, whether they're lapsed Catholics or whether they're still practicing Catholics. Yeah. What do you think it is about the link between Catholicism and the act of writing, which is so powerful?
I think for me it was something to do with the sense of sacrament. And, Catholicism is a very physical religion. You're touching things all the time. You're smelling stuff all the time. You're making motions with your body. And the notion of a sacrament is it's an outward sign of an inward grace. And I think, in a sense, that's the connection for me with writing. It's like when I'm writing, I try to make my writing very physical, and it is a physical act. It's an act of the body, and you make marks on paper, so it's an actual physical thing. But you're trying to make it in such a way that you affect something like beneath the words and above the words, and that is sacramental in that sense. And I'm not saying I'm not saying it's a sacrament, but I think that is the connection with Catholicism. And also for me, it was, the sense of heaven and hell, the terrors of hell. I said, as a grown man, I go, the terrors of hell. The dreams you have as a Catholic boy, you've got to find some way to kind of calm them down. And I think in some ways writing is a way of getting over the fear of hell.
One of the writers that you're often, or the elements of this writer who are compared to you, is William Blake.
Yeah.
And William Blake was this sort of, fantastic mystical character who saw angels in the trees, didn't he? Mm. And I think in particularly with Skellig, I was reminded, this sort of fantastic character who could be, what is he? Is he an angel or is he a tramp? And but the thing about Skellig is that it is utterly transformative. Mm. And I wondered about this other book that you've chosen, William Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience. Mm. What was it about reading those very short poems? Very short, yeah. And on the face of it, very simple poems, almost childlike, actually, until you really start to unravel them. Yeah. So when did you start reading them, and then kind of how did they get into you?
I read them as a teenager, and I remember reading them at school in sixth form. We didn't study Blake, but I remember reading Blake in the library. I remember the moment of reading O Rose Thou Art Sick in the library one deadly dull afternoon in the sixth form. And it just, just the power of it, this little poem, O Rose Thou Art Sick, the invisible worm that flies in the night. And then really I read Blake, but then didn't think a great deal about Blake until I was writing Skellig. And then when I was writing Skellig, I suddenly realized that this book that I'd kind of forgotten about was central to it. And it was something to do with, the apparent lightness and simplicity of the songs themselves, the fact that they were attached to illustrations, the fact that they seemed very childlike, and that Blake was Blake's very weird, and people keep trying to get rid of Blake, don't they? Say, William Blake.
Definitely.
Let's forget Blake, but we can't, and he keeps coming back and back. And also in Skellig, it was Mina in Skellig, one of the characters in Skellig, who kind of brought Blake in. Mina, who began talking about Blake and began quoting Blake. And it sounds crazy, she was my character, and she started doing all these things that I hadn't expected. And lots of things about school. I'd been a teacher. I was a teacher at the time. And how can a bird that is born for joy sit in a cage and sing? It's perfect for discussions of education.
Yes. And you're right about Blake. He is often dismissed as just being mad, isn't he? Completely mad. Yeah. Whereas actually I think with Blake, as in your work as well, there is something which is really beautiful but not definable.
And I think that's really important. You can't actually pin it down. And that's another thing that kind of remained after Catholicism, I think, that sense of mystery. Because when Catholics get stuck, they say, it's a mystery. And you think, come on, In kind of intellectual terms, you think, well, of course, that shows, how pointless all this is. But actually then as a writer, you can say, well, it's a mystery after that. And what is Skellig is a mystery. And Blake is like that. Blake is indefinable. And I love that about Blake. Was
it also the illustrations? Because the illustrations are luminous. I can remember the first time I saw them. I read the poems, and then I saw them alongside the illustrations. I almost couldn't believe it. They seemed incredibly contemporary, but to have something sort of so beautiful about them, your eye was immediately drawn to them.
You're amazing on them. The Blake that I have is a facsimile of the first editions, and they're fantastic and amazing blends of darkness and light, and the way there's one here of there's a halo which just shines through the darkness. So obviously it connected with my sort of Catholic heart because the halo was light, dark, well, lovely, but it's not about Catholicism. It was about the weirdness of human life, the weirdness of being us.
All right, talking about the weirdness of human life, the third book that you gave to me was Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, which has got to be one of the darkest, bleakest novels I think I've ever read.
Yeah.
I can remember reading it. I think we probably read it about the same time when we were sort of early teenagers.
Yeah.
And I was completely in love, but also repulsed by the anti-hero character of Raskolnikov. So why Crime and Punishment?
I read it, I think, when I was about 19. I was at university, and I did this amazing seminar. I went to UEA, and it was kind of very inventive sort of teaching and learning. We did this amazing seminar called Superfluous Man or Existentialist Hero. So we read, and I thought, what am I? And it's perfect for a teenager. Am I superfluous or am I existentialist hero? And anybody who attended that seminar, and I know several of them, their lives were utterly changed. They've never been quite the same. But we read Dostoevsky and Sartre and Camus and Turgenev and Goncharov, and it was just amazing. And then I remember reading Crime and Punishment, and here's this solitary, tortured soul, Raskolnikov, who commits this awful act, then goes through this terrible process of guilt and a kind of approaching redemption at the end. And I just loved it, and I was horrified, but I just, I remember I had flu at the time, and I was living in this little room on Earlham Road in Norwich, and living with this very strange family, and I was up in my room reading Raskolnikov, having flu, and I felt like Raskolnikov.
Did you look like Raskolnikov?
I probably did. Actually, I've never been that gaunt.
But also the thing about Crime and Punishment, which makes it so sort of unutterably bleak, really, is delusion, self-delusion, massive, massive self-delusion, and hubris as well, because he kills this old woman very, very early on in the book, because he can.
Because he can, and it's an act of kind of will, and he says, yes, I can do this. Why shouldn't I do this? I'm intelligent, I'm clever in this woman, I've got more advantage, I'll kill this woman, and therefore my life will be changed. And then he goes through the torture of all of that, and almost, gets to the point of he confesses, and it's obvious that he's done it to outsiders, and it was just an amazing thing to read. And its connections with the other books that I was reading at the time. I remember walking through Norwich and feeling like Raskolnikov, and then during the same time reading Sartre's Nausea. And I remember walking along the street in Norwich reading Nausea and feeling I was inhabiting La Nausea, and I was nauseous. But that's how you read when you're that age, don't you?
Completely immersive reading.
It was amazing. And when I'd studied English American literature, and it was very kind of hands-off kind of course. I spent most of my time just lying on sofas reading.
Oh, great.
That's what we did. And then occasionally go to seminars where you were asked, are you an existentialist hero or are you a superfluous man? So I'll have a pint and think about that.
But it's also it's got a grim sort of, very grim kind of redemption about it, hasn't it? Which comes towards the end.
It is,
I often think it's got to be a young man's novel, that, hasn't it?
I think it has, yeah. And it does have a kind of redemption. And, the torture, maybe it's heaven and hell again. It's the torture of going to Siberia, the deep cold. But then he has his angelic Sonia who kind of goes there as well.
Were you ever attracted to any, did you go through the whole of Dostoevsky? Because that's often what people do, isn't it? They come across Crime and Punishment, and then they think, okay, I'm going to read the whole lot. And then you quite quickly get bogged down. Yeah,
so I read The Idiot and Brothers Karamazov, and just, what is this stuff?
Yes.
The 2 volumes of the Karamazov. What is mean something. Stop having these difficult names. But just the act of reading it and being totally confused and charged, the charge of reading at that age. And it was like reading Lawrence about the same time. Another book I almost chose was The Rainbow. And I remember on a train journey reading The Rainbow by Lawrence, and just thinking, this is it. This is the greatest writing that could ever be. First 3 chapters of The Rainbow.
And so when you read this, you saying that you were studying at UEA, did it, because you've been scribbling away before this and making your books and that sort of thing, did you then come back and start I mean, did it redefine your writing? I guess that's what I'm asking you.
I think it must have, yeah. I think
Shape
everything, yeah, I think everything that you read that you love, and it has an effect on you. It happens right through your life. You know, you keep on discovering new writers who, you know, will change you, that they'll help you to become you. That's what you're trying to do. Writers talk about trying to find a voice, and you kind of find a voice by picking up things from other voices. So it's a kind of merging of other voices and yourself.
Was there anything that you came across that you hate, you know, maybe you had to read, that you hated, you didn't get it, it really rankled with you? Can you remember anything that really just didn't speak to you at all? Or were you just like a sponge and just absorbing everything?
I suppose I was fortunate. Reading is always a kind of act of almost prejudice. So you say, I'm not going to read that, I'm going to read this.
Yeah.
So I was kind of, I suppose, quite prejudiced in my reading. Unfortunate at UEA that at that time that you could kind of read what you liked. You did a seminar about the city novel in America and ended up reading Ralph Ellison and Hubert Selby Jr. And those kind of novels were really fantastic to me. I kind of avoided novels that did not really go for were the kind of almost like social comedy, you know, kind of social manners, stories about kind of middle-class life never appealed to me.
So your fourth book, okay, talking about comedy, I don't know how comedic this is, Mystery and Manners by Flannery O'Connor.
Who's a Southern States writer, and she helped me to define what I was going to be as a writer, because she was a Southern States Catholic writer who wrote short stories and novels, but also wrote the most amazing essays and lectures about being a writer. And some of the things that I read in this book, just, you know, you read books at the right time, and when I was kind of thinking, how can I be this kind of writer? How can I be a writer that somehow is reaching out to the world, but is also attached to what I come from? And reading stuff like this from Flannery O'Connor was just, I thought, oh, God, you know, you understand. But she'd been a Catholic, she'd been a regional writer, and just being the most fantastic thing.
When was she writing then?
She was writing in the 40s, 50s.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And a wonderful writer. Some of you will know Flannery O'Connor. Just glorious. And she wrote, the discovery of being bound through the senses to a particular society and a particular history, to particular sounds and a particular idiom, is for the writer the beginning of a recognition that first puts his work in a real human perspective for him. He discovers that the imagination is not free, but is bound. For many young writers, Catholic or otherwise, this is not a pleasant discovery. And I remember reading that thing. Yeah, and it was kind of, on the one hand, I think, it's just like, I can't do anything about it. But then you think, once you recognize those apparent limitations, then you become free. It said, some writers would like to set their stories in a region whose way of life seems nearer to the spirit of what they think they have to say, or better, they would like to eliminate the region altogether and approach the infinite directly. But this is not even a possibility. And for me, it was reading that, I thought, yeah. And this is a copy I've had for 20 years, and it's filled with highlights and notes and scribbles. And she was really, this book really did change my life.
And do you go back to those books? When you're talking about, you know, reading that book when you were much, much younger and making notes and scribbles in it, do you go back now and look at the notes and scribbles and think, have you changed much? Or are you still essentially the same person that read that book?
I think in many ways I'm still the same person. Obviously I've changed and I'm doing different stuff, but when I do look back at Flannery and read things like that, I think, yeah. And it kind of, if I'm, you know, self-doubt is always, you're always full of doubt, you know, the cliff edge is always just there. And when I'm troubled, I go and look at Flannery O'Connor and think, thanks, Flannery, yeah, that's right. It's all right.
Gives you confidence. Did you think of yourself then as a regional writer? Because, I mean, it seems to me that you're writing, all right, it's set in a very particular place, and it's really grounded and rooted in that place, but actually it could be anywhere in many respects, because it's the characters that you're talking about which rise out of this place. So did you feel yourself as a regional writer? And if so, what effect did that have on your sort of personal development as a writer?
For a time, it was a problem for me because it wasn't that I defined myself as a regional writer, but other people would. And I remember...
Who?
Oh, I remember an agent, and I sent her my stories, and I actually chased her on Durham Station. And I said, oh, did you read my stories? And she said, oh, yes. She said, I thought they were rather good. She said, but they seem to come from a northern working class voice, and I already have some of those. Oh. And she got on the train and went back to London.
Oh, how crushing.
And for a time when I was submitting my work, I thought about pretending I lived in London. To be Glaswegian was quite trendy at the time, so I thought I'd pretend to be Glaswegian or I'd pretend to be a woman. So I went through all of these humiliations that lots of writers know about. Until eventually I thought, oh, bugger it, I'll just do it. And then when I first started to do it, it was when I wrote a collection of stories called Counting Stars, which are a bit like the stories in Half a Creature from the Sea. And saying there's nothing I can do, I'll just write a bunch of stories about the place I love, people I love. And I wrote it for the people I love. I wrote them for my sisters and my brother. And the paradox was that when I just turned away and began to write those things, then I began to get a big audience. And it was only when I really began to do it that, my work gets read all around the world.
Is it because I often interview lots and lots of writers, and they always say, almost without fail, that they write for just one or two or three people, or they write for themselves. They don't write for an audience. If the audience happen to like it, that's all well and good. But that's the way they kind of key into their voice. So you were saying you were writing for kind of members of the family, almost for like an entertainment purpose. And is that the point that you hit it?
At that point, that's when it was. And they were literally written for 4 people, my 3 sisters and my brother. And I was sending them to them before I did anything. If they liked them, then I would send them out and try and get them published. And I began to get in magazines that I've been kind of trying to get into for years, and won some small prizes. And and my audience started to grow. And it was weird, because intellectually we know that the universal exists in the local, but I really kind of experienced that. It was amazing. And another, Patrick Kavanagh, the Irish writer, helped me as well, because one of his great lines was the curse of the provincial, that he thinks only about the metropolis. But if you are, the parochial mentality is never in any doubt about the artistic and social validity of his parish. And I think that was really important to me as well. It's not kind of making excuses. It's not doubting the roots of my work and say, this is where my work is set. This is what I'm doing. I don't care about the metropolis.
The last book was a book that I hadn't heard of, which was published, I think, quite recently, Orpheus, The Song of Life by Anne Rowe. So tell us about Anne Rowe, and tell us about this book as well, because it's a quite unusual book, isn't it, in that it's a biography of a fictional character.
Yeah, it's a biography of Orpheus. And I read it when I was preparing to write a book called A Song for Allegria, which is an updating of the Orpheus and Eurydice legend myth set on Tyneside, among Tyneside sixth formers. And it was a library. I was walking through Leighton Phil in Newcastle. Oh, who knows the Leighton Phil? And this book was facing me as I walked past, the new books now. Yeah. I thought, Orpheus, The Song of Life, that looks interesting. And I just took it off the shelf and began to look at it. Oh, that's important. And I immediately bought it because I wanted to scribble all over it. And read it, and it's just one of those books that sends your mind off in all kinds of directions. Anne Rowe's an academic, a biographer. It's an amazing work. And it led me into thinking about what writing is as well, because I was moving more and more towards a kind of belief in a kind of the Orphic nature of writing, that the song comes through you. And this little quote here, that when I read this, I got shivers. I'm getting shivers up my spine now, because that's what I'm trying to do. That's what in a sense, all artists are trying to do, something that transcends themselves. We talk about art being about self-expression. I think it's not really. I think it's expressing something that's not us. And this Orpheus taught that it was possible through ritual purity and song, ecstatic prayer, to become one with the principles on which the universe was founded. It wasn't a matter of emulation or imitations. His followers were challenged to become what they already were. In other words, Rilke had heard from him before, become what you are, become what you are. And reading that, it read me back to Rilke's Sonnets to Orpheus, which again I'd read at university and loved and didn't quite understand, and then read them again and didn't quite understand them. But it was all about the the nature of art and song, that it will pour through you if you get out of the way, the writer gets out of the way. And it led me to another book, which I think I've got, and I couldn't believe it when I read this. This is a book called Performance by the lutenist, Anthony Rulli, who's an amazing musician, and he wrote this incredible book about performance, and it's really about the Renaissance concept of what it is to make art, and it's just extraordinary about, again, the performer getting out of the way and the music coming through them. So yeah, Orpheus, The Song of Life, amazing book by Anne Rowe.
Do you think you have become what you are?
I think that's what we all try to be, isn't it? What we try to do. As a writer, that's how I try to become what I am. Yeah.
I think one of the things that's very engaging about your work is that it has a childlike quality, a childlike wonder and awe to it. And in fact, you have that as well. I've worked with you on a programme about the fantastic children's book, Stig of the Dump. And as part of this, we went to interview the author of Stig of the Dump, Clive King, who I think was about 91, 92 at this point. And we went round, and actually Clive King is Stig of the Dump. He is the most incredible person. And as we went round this sort of slightly ramshackle house, I saw you transformed into a boy full of wonder, and you were completely engaged with this. And I wonder if that's the appeal of your books, that you pour all this kind of childlike awe and wonder into it, and it comes out really like that. Do you think you have maintained that?
I think, I hope I have. And, children will often say, what should I do if I want to be a writer? And I'll say, well, just look at the world and walk around. I was talking to a girl the other day, and she said to me, she said, you know what I like doing? She said, because we were talking about writing. She said, I just like wandering about. And I said, be a writer. And I said, so do I. And I said, people often, children say, what's your hobby? And I say, well, I just like wandering about and looking at things. And this girl got it. And I said, it's amazing, isn't it? So that sense of, the world, seeing the world as something really beautiful, I think is so important, despite all the horrors and the horrible things that are in the world, especially now. One of the problems, I think, is, people, I don't even want to name them, they've grown up in the wrong way. They've grown up and they've lost that some childlikeness. And you see it in them, they're kind of dead inside because they've lost some sense of childish wonder. And it sounds very romantic, and I think in some ways as I get older, I am getting a bit more romantic. But I also think it's true, I really do think it's true, that to retain some kind of childlike wonder at the amazingness of the world will stop you doing some terrible things. Children understand this. If you talk to children about, say, the treatment of animals, they're astonished, that we can put up with this. If you talk to, like my daughter's generation about attitudes towards certain people because of what they are, who they are, they're astonished because they say, well, they're just people, and they're filled with a wonder and love for the world and for the people and the animals that are in it. But then people grow up and become dull and boring, and you can often tell them because they look down on children.
Hi there.
Hi.
I just wondered, when it comes to coming up with an idea for a new story, there's a zillion things you could write about. How do you choose the topic, and what criteria do you use to say to yourself, yes, this is a goer, or no, I'll park that one?
I do it through something will come and get me. And it's like a lot of the kind of the users of notebooks is finding the thing that's going to come and get you. So I might have a notion first. At the moment, I'm writing a story about the end of the First World War, which will come out for the anniversary of the end of the First World War. And I thought I knew I had the kind of story I wanted, so I started scribbling about and then started to write it. But I got, a couple of thousand words in. I thought, it's not that story, it's this other story. And if I'd said, I've got to write this story because that's the one I planned, then I'm on a dead end. But if I say, I thought I was writing this story, but I've got this one. So it's kind of being open enough to be discovered. But you can only be discovered by doing the thing, by using pens and pencils and typing.
there's a connection between the head and the hand, that sometimes when you're writing on the computer, that almost acts as a block to creativity? Is that how you feel?
I do, I really think that. And, you know, I talk a lot to children, I talk a lot to teachers, and it's like when you hear government officials talking about the teaching of writing, you just think, oh, that's so stupid. I mean, they're deeply stupid. And I think we all know the feeling, if you try and write something by thinking about it, think really hard, it becomes impossible. Thinking gets in the way. So you have to kind of subvert that by doing this kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you set out to write for children originally, or did you simply write your stories and then they were marketed to children?
I never expected to write for children. I never thought I would. But then when I was writing the stories for Counting Stars, I began to kind of re-experience that kind of intellectual and emotional and imaginative world of the child. So those stories were all written from a kind of point of view of a child. And then when I finished those, I was literally walking along the street and Skellig just started telling itself in my head. And when I began to write it down, I thought, oh, it's a book for children. And I was amazed, but also felt really liberated. Yeah, so I didn't set out to do it, but having become it, the possibilities of storytelling inside the children's book world are infinite. You know, if you're going to go into a children's book department, have a look at the different kinds of stories and different kinds of book shapes, the different kinds of art that goes into them. It's really a kind of fund of creativity and experimentation.
You mentioned about the impression upon you made by illustrations in the King Arthur stories, and then again with William Blake. I'm just thinking, do you work closely? Do you have your own work illustrated, or the covers of your books?
Yeah, I've done a lot of illustrated books now. It's really important, and that's one of the things that I was kind of allowed to do as a children's author. So I've done collaborations with amazing artists like Dave McKean, or I don't have any of them with me. The book Half a Creature from the Sea is illustrated by Eleanor Taylor. I've got an amazing book coming out. I can say that because I'm talking about the illustrations. An amazing book coming out next year called The Dam, with extraordinary artwork by Levi Pinfold. So yeah, working with illustrators is really important to me.
And when you're working with illustrators, do you really work alongside them? Or do you write the stories first and then the illustrations come after?
Yeah. So we don't work in close
proximity.
No.
But then, do you then go back and review the stories that you've written in the light of the illustrations? Does it make it do you see them as something different?
Sometimes you make, especially in a short text like this book, which is coming out called The Dam, I adjusted some of the words to fit the pictures better. Yeah.
David, there was an interesting session this morning where somebody said that they'd heard Louis de Bernière interviewed, and he'd not quite said that he hated Captain Corelli's Mandolin, but that it wasn't the book that he felt that most fully realised his vision as a writer. And I wondered if, I mean, Skellig is for better or worse, and it's a brilliant book, is the book that will be most closely associated with you. But I wondered if there was any of your other books that you felt when you were thinking in that Blakean sense of getting to that point where you were, you know, you'd got to where you wanted to be. Were there books that you felt ought to have had more attention?
Yeah, there are. And I mean, all the books have done well, and, you know, they've been sort of well reviewed and they're well loved and everything. Skellig, of course, I love Skellig, and I look at Skellig and I think, how did I do that? Because and Skellig almost happened to me. It was almost like a gift from beyond. In a sense, I didn't write it. So I admire the books that I feel as if I've written. So a book like Kit's Wilderness, the book which was the book that came out after Skellig, is just a much better book in terms of writing than Skellig is. Or a book that came out about 5 years ago called The Tightrope Walkers. And I think The Tightrope Walkers might be, you know, the best thing I've ever written. But it was terribly published in this country. It was published really well in the States. It's interesting, talking about regional and language, the books that have been most northern have actually had amazing reviews in the States. Like True Tale of the Monsters, Billy Dean, which is written in phonetic Geordie, which really upset a few people in this country. Americans just loved it and got rave reviews.
Why do you think that is, then?
I think it's something to do with the sense that they're not unfamiliar with regional voices. Like with Flannery O'Connor, or another American writer who was a big influence on me was a Texan writer called William Guyon. And Guyon wrote this amazing kind of blend of standard American and Texan dialect. And I remember reading Guyon for the first time thinking, he's writing Geordie. Yeah. So I learned how to write Geordie by.
I think it's a class thing as well.
Yeah, I do. Absolutely. And I went through a period of thinking, no, it can't possibly be. I think it's so much to do with class, so much to do with class in this country. I remember another book I was going to bring was The First 49, which is Hemingway's stories. And I remember the act of pulling out Hemingway's stories in Felling Library, as I must have been about 14, opening the book and thinking, wow, you can write like that. And it was to do with class, and it was to do with accepting all kinds of experience and, welcoming all kinds of experience. Whereas, in English life and still in English letters, there is still a kind of dominance of a kind of subculture which still tries to dominate in politics and culture. So I think it's loads to do with class. I do, yes.
I'm probably going to put you in a bit of a difficult position here because I'm
Go
going
on
to
then.
ask not for a favourite character that you've written, but maybe one that influenced you, or when you were writing them had like a sort of power in the way that they were crafted or anything like that.
Yeah.
When you write, was there ever a character that stood out to have a sort of physicality about them?
Yeah, it's so weird. You write a character and the character influences you. The character kind of changes you. So Mina in Skellig. And then 10 years after Skellig, I wrote My Name is Mina, which is Mina's notebooks. Mina, and the book is called My Name is Mina by David Almond. And I'm not called Mina, I'm called David Almond. But by pretending, or not pretending, imagining that I was Mina, I became better at being David Almond than I could be if I was David Almond. And it's kind of, it sounds bonkers, but it's true. And I was talking about this, and again, thinking about children. I was talking about this in a school in the west end of Newcastle, a wonderful school in quite a troubled area. And I said, when I was writing My Name is Mina, I could write better because I was Mina. And there was a little boy watching me. And he said, I know what you mean, David. He said, when I play football, I'm Lionel Messi. And when I play as Lionel Messi, I'm much better than I am as me. But that's what it's like. And it's weird that you can become better at being you by pretending you're somebody else, which is maybe why, that's maybe why writers write. Because you stop being you. It's not about you. It's about being the story. You become the language. It's like the quote about Orpheus. You become something else. It's not you. Not you.
David, could we just finish with a reading, do you think?
Yeah. I'll read a bit from, this is a story called Joe Quinn's Poltergeist. And it's coming out next year as a standalone, as a kind of graphic novel illustrated by the great Dave McKean. So this is the beginning of Joe Quinn's Poltergeist. So, I'm in Hollyhill Park with Geordie Craggs. We're watching the lasses play tennis when Joe Quinn saunters through the gate. Pretend we've not seen, I say. It's no good. He heads straight for us. He's got a packet of coconut mushrooms and he's holding them out. Stupid Geordie takes one. He even says, "Tar." "Have another," says Joe. "Gan on, I've got tons." Maria Caldwell jumps high and grunts and smashes the ball straight into the fence. "Prefer a midget gem," says Joe to me. "I've got some of them and all." "No," I mutter. "No wrong with being friendly," he says. "I'll have one," says Geordie, and Joe smiles and sits down on the grass close by. It's the middle of the afternoon, the middle of the holidays, and hot as hell. The air's shimmering and you can feel the heat rising from the earth. Josephine Minto wipes her forehead with a towel, swigs from a bottle of lemonade or something, and gets ready to serve. She looks over to check I'm still watching. She's the best, it's obvious. She'll win easily. The yellow ball's a blur as it flashes over the net. Maria doesn't even see it. I want to cheer, but I don't. "I've got a poltergeist," says Joe, as Josephine gets ready to serve again. "A what?" says Geordie. "A poltergeist." I spit. Typical Joe bloody Quinn. "What's one of them?" asked Geordie. "It's a kind of ghost," says Joe. "Davy'll know." "Davy?" I say nout. There was stuff flying all over the house the other night, Joe goes on. Cups and plates and stuff. Stuff flying, says Geordie. That's what they do, poltergeists. They send everything balmy. Geordie's mouth dropped open. There's a window smashed and all, said Joe, and the door's hanging off its hinges. Hell's teeth. Aye, says Joe. My mum says it's a sign of disturbances in the spirit world, or the house has entered some kind of vortex or something. Vortex, says Geordie. Geordie, man, I mutter. Ah, nah, says Joe. Hard to believe her. Maybe you should come and see for yourselves. Could we, says Geordie. That is, if you're not too scared, says Joe. Of course we're not. Oh, Davy, when shall we come? It starts happening around about tea time, says Joe. So come for tea. Come today. I'll tell me mum to put some extra chips on, eh? Geordie's all wide-eyed. Ah, he says, I'll read Joe. Joe gets up and walks away. Flying cups, says Geordie. I sigh, stupid Geordie. Joe turns around and lobs a few midget gems at us. Geordie catches none of them and starts picking them out of the grass. Josephine Mindo squeals and yells, Gaiman first said to Miss Mindo. Broken windows, gasps Geordie. Do you think we'll really see it? Aye, I said, we'll see it's just daft Joe Quinn, and he's even daft our mother. It's worth having a look, though, eh? You've said yourself that the world's a weird place. But I didn't mean Joe Quinn, and I didn't mean bloody poltergeists. He jams a few midget gems into his mouth. At least we'll get some chips, he says.